Amendment 16, Baroness Goher. Amendment 17, Baroness Fox of Buckley.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendments 17 and 18. It's interesting listening to the discussion that we've had this evening, because a lot of people that I speak to, particularly women, assume that the consultation on the Victims Code or discussions about enhancing victims' rights are going to mean better support for female victims, particularly in relation to service provision. And all that Amendment 17 seeks to do is to clarify what I'm sure is the intention of the bill, which is to, in fact, be very supportive of, for example, single-sex provision for women and appropriate service provision that can be given, but to ensure that we know what we're talking about. It might appear that getting a commitment to the police and crime commissioners, integrated care boards and local authorities all working together to commission support services for example, victims of domestic abuse or sexual abuse, ensuring that they can access the services they need, and lots of discussion about services by women and for women would be clear enough. However, as I explained at committee, and in a much appreciated and helpful meeting with Lord Roborough and officials, and I back up what other people have said about how it was very refreshing to have a minister who was prepared to, or somebody from the team who was prepared to talk to us quite openly. At that meeting, hearing from the charity Sex Matters, all is not what it seems. And I fear that if the government doesn't address this in relation to sorting out the language and clarifications, then its aspirations to enhance female victims' rights will suffer because of confusions over the law and over the definition of sex. The women, by women and for women might seem a straightforward proposition until we ask what is a woman. And in 2024, that has become a contentious question. Over recent years, we've lost clarity over what we mean by the categories man and women, and that can undermine women's services. This has happened due to the insistence from some quarters, and often very powerful quarters, that women's services must be trans-inclusive by including men who identify as women into what should be women-only provision. For example, in the Terms and References policy for the Avon and Somerset Police's Women's Independent Advisory Group, just to use that as one example, it states, in this group, we use women as a term which is inclusive of the legally protected characteristic of female sex and gender identity, as well as gender expression, and those who are perceived and treated as women, and those who identify as women. This is such an expansive, non-material, confusing definition of women that I think this amendment is simply trying to ensure that where the Victim Code talks of services for women, or any assumption that there will be services for women victims, that we use the clear category of sex registered at birth, rather than that ever-expansive term in which women, as in biological natal women, are merely a subcategory of this newly expanded definition of woman. Sometimes we're told that unless trans women are treated as women, it's in breach of Schedule 3 of the Equality Act. But I think we do need, or the government needs to clarify the law in this regard, because in fact and in law, a service can be female only as a matter of policy, and apart from anything else, the Equality Act requires public authorities to have due regard to meeting the specific needs of women. Another misunderstood factor, even when a person has acquired a different gender under the Gender Recognition Act, that does not affect the status of the person as a man or a woman in relation to the Equality Act. Indeed, it would be helpful if the government could give clear guidance to people applying for GRCs that this change in documentation does not give them the right to access services or spaces set aside for the opposite sex. And such clear guidance would also be helpful in terms of service providers and commissions, I think, in relation to how people read the Victims Code. I wanted to just illustrate the negative impact of the kind of confusions on women victims seeking help by citing a worrying piece of investigative journalism, a brilliant piece of journalism, in fact. Children of transitioners collated evidence that there is no women-only service provision in Bristol. And this mirrors exactly the situation in Brighton that I described in some detail at committee. Now, I have got detailed examples from Bristol here, but I appreciate that the House will not bear with me. So I won't go through them all at all. But needless to say that if you're a woman who reports, who's been raped, who's been sexually assaulted, who goes to the police and reports domestic abuse to police officers in Bristol, they are going to suggest to these distraught women, to these victims, where they will be able to get further support. And they may well be sent to, by women, for women, provision, and they will feel are safe spaces. It's just that when you actually look at the provision in Bristol, you will find consistently used that women-only services are also accessible to and welcome trans women. And trans women are men who identify as women, and they should be provided with services as appropriate, but not in women's only services. So this is not actually women only, it's mixed sex. I was struck when the Integrated Care Board of Bristol lists a range of by and for women organisations. And just to use one example it gives is Womankind. You think with a title like that the clue would be in the name. And Womankind calls itself a service for women and girls. And displayed online, it's got lovely suffragette colours. I mean, what's not to like? But actually, in correspondence with Womankind, another story emerges. This is what Womankind says. Womankind is for women and for those who identify such in a significant way, including those who experience discrimination as, for instance, trans women and non-binary. Womankind confirmed, after the investigation was done, that there is not one abuse support service in Bristol for natal women victims alone. And Womankind's advice for those unhappy with this situation was, quote, to try London, which seems to me to be extraordinary. And I think that the reason I use these examples is that I know from replies from the dispatch box and at the meeting, there's very much a feeling that this is not a problem that the government has detected when meeting service providers and commissioners. And I think that it's important to dig beneath the language of saying, oh, well, there is provision available, what's the problem? I think it also depends on who you ask. So Bristol Women's Voice, an organisation who claims to represent women's voices in the council and to the police, don't themselves see a problem. So in that sense, if the government were talking to them, they'd think, oh, there's no problem. But they don't think there's a problem because they also have a policy of trans plus inclusion in relation to their definition of what a woman is. It would also be naive not to look at the evidence about how layers of public bodies and local authorities have been lobbied and influenced by ideologically driven NGOs such as Stonewall, that's been much in the news of late. And also, ministers tell us that it's up to service providers to choose the most appropriate services. But as Lord Roberts, I hope, heard from Helen Joyce and Mayor Forstater, in terms of the evidence in the Sex Matters report, Women's Services, a Sector Silenced, many of those who provide women's-only services often self-censor to placate funders to avoid being investigated, ostracised, disciplined, or maligned as bigots, all career-threatening. And in case you think that this is all hyperbole and what am I talking about, I think it's a very similar pattern to those whistleblowing medics at the Tavistock clinic whose stories of malpractice have now so vividly been exposed in the Cass Review as true, and they were maligned for raising them. And it's a credit, I think, to Victoria Atkins in an excellent statement in the other place who drew this out, and credit to Wes Streeting from the opposition who also accepted the caste review as being an important step forward. And Kemi Badenoch made the point that, quote, had those who warned that gender services in the NHS had been hijacked by ideologues had been listened to instead of gagged, kids would not have been harmed and the caste review would not have been required. So although I'm making a fuss, I do want to say to the government that maybe they should listen to the warnings from whistleblowers in the women's services sector who are explaining that we are denying women victims single-sex provision, causing great harm and trauma for vulnerable women who might self-exclude or might well not even seek support if services they're referred to may include men identifying as women. Very, very quickly now, just to say something about Amendment 18, which because I discussed it fully at committee, it's just an attempt to use the Victims' Code to tackle a loophole in that incarcerated or registered sex offenders, if they change their gender, even just by a self-declaration, then that person is afforded enhanced privacy protection that allows the new identity to disappear from view in terms of criminal justice, safeguarding normal procedures and criminal justice bodies. Through the sensitivity applications route, a sex offender who changes their gender identity can conceal their past identity and sex for the purpose of, for example, disclosure and barring services, DBS, checking processes. And that means a sex offender's past name and identity are not displayed on any DBS certificates, and they can have their self-declared gender identity instead. At committee, I explained the reason I knew about this loophole was due to the story of Clive Bundy, who was in prison for 15 years in 2016, released half the way through, having sexually abused his own daughter, Kerry Lee Galvin, throughout her childhood. Clive Bundy changed his gender before his early release as a self-identifying woman named Claire Fox, which is what drew my attention to this particular case. This amendment tackles the anomaly. Due to Bundy's enhanced privacy rights in relation to his gender change, whereas Kerry Lee, his victim and his daughter, had no right to know that he'd been released as a woman called Claire. After his release, Clive Bundy, aka Claire Fox, went to live in the same town as his daughter and her daughter, and Clive Bundy could apply as Claire Fox for jobs or to be a volunteer locally and work with children, including potentially his own granddaughter, and no one would know. And any DBS check would not show up red flags, and the family would not be forewarned. Amendment 18 just wants the government to look at, can we do something about this loophole?
Amendment proposed, clause 2, page 2, line 27, at end, insert the words as printed on the marshalled list.
My Lords, I want to thank the noble lady Baroness Fox for tabling Amendment 17, which seeks to ensure victims are able to access support from someone of the same sex as registered at birth, and that women-only support service provision is confined to those registered as women at birth. And I want to thank her and Mayor Forstatter and Helen Joyce from Sex Matters for their time in discussing these matters with me yesterday ahead of this debate. From the outset, let me be clear that this government recognises the importance of a victim feeling confident they can ask for particular things, such as someone of a particular sex, to make them feel comfortable and help them best engage with support. We also recognise that single-sex services can and should be provided in some circumstances. That is why we have written to providers who receive funding under our Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Fund to make clear our expectation that they should take reasonable steps to provide spaces which exclude service users who are not biologically female or male, where that has been requested by a victim and where it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim in line with the Equality Act 2010. I have listened to the concerns raised by the noble lady and want to reassure her that officials regularly engage with those commissioning and providing services through ongoing grant management processes. We will continue to use these channels to understand if there are any barriers experienced in the delivery of single-sex services and how government might support services to address these, and we will continue the conversation that we have started with Sex Matters to carefully consider how we can best serve victims. In relation to support workers, we have included a dedicated section on tailoring support to meet victims' needs in the draft Independent Domestic Violence Advisor, IDVA, and Independent Sexual Violence Advisor, ISVA, guidance. It sets out different considerations for supporting both male and female victims, which may include a preference for a particular sex of their IDVA or ISVA. The Noble Lady asked specifically what we are doing to improve this guidance. The draft guidance has a specific section on how IDVAs and ISVAs may respond to meet the needs of different types of victims, which includes examples of how they may tailor their support to meet the distinct needs of female and male victims. For example, the guidance recommends how the IDVA or ISVA can address commonly held misconceptions about female and male victims which may prevent them from reporting their experiences. The guidance also highlights that some victims may prefer to be supported by a worker of their own sex and may prefer to access single-sex services where available. Ultimately, as the Noble Lady referred to, we do consider that service providers are best placed to engage with the needs of victims and adjust their service accordingly. There is a practical element to this too. While we know providers will do their utmost to take into account the preferences of the victim, they're clearly constrained by their staff's skills, expertise, capacity and availability to ensure they meet the victim's needs. It is for that reason that it's simply not workable to seek to entitle victims to a particular support worker they have requested. Beyond that, I respectfully disagree with the Noble Lady's suggestion that in all cases victims should be entitled to support from someone of the same sex as registered at birth. To require this to happen in all cases requested, service providers may need to intentionally exclude transgender persons from support roles, which could amount to unlawful discrimination depending on the circumstances pursuant to the Equality Act 2010. Finally, a legal point, but an important one. The Victims' Code would not provide the legal effect being sought by this amendment. Mirroring the current scope of the Victims' Code, the amendment that we have tabled, which imposes a duty to provide services in accordance with the Code, only applies to persons who have functions of a public nature, which would not extend to third parties who provide support services for victims. As such, we could not set expectations regarding delivering services in a certain way through the Victims' Code. For these reasons, I urge the Noble Lady to withdraw her amendment.
Sorry. At this late hour, I will take my Lord's note of what I'm reading Hansard, what's been said, and write with any clarifications, if that would be okay with the Minister. I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not a straightforward issue because of the ideological context in which it's occurring, and I hope that because of the discussion that we've recently had around the CAS review, and that my noble lords will read the CAS review and the details of the brilliant discussion on it in the other place yesterday, they will see that this is not simply a technical matter, and therefore that needs to be taken into account. I would also just like to register my great disappointment that noble lords from the other opposition parties had nothing to say in relation to single-sex provision for women victims, however late it is, however unpopular I am. I just think it's a shame.
Does the noble lady wish to withdraw her amendment? Is it your lordship's pleasure that the amendment be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn. Amendment 18, Baroness Fox. Not moved? Not moved.
My Lords, I beg to move that further consideration on a report be adjourned.
The question is that further consideration on report be adjourned. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.